Alright, welcome back to the garage. It's been a while since we have done a video in here, and it's been a while since I've worked on the Husky. Today and over the next few days, we're actually going to be doing some top end work on the bike. It's at about 170 hours right now and almost 4,000 miles, so it's about that time to get into the motor and look over the piston and the rings and check for wear and make sure everything looks good. We're actually going to be replacing the piston and the rings, as well as any other parts that need replaced in there as well. I figure that the bike could probably go a little bit longer. I do oil changes every 10 hours and I replace the air filter almost every other ride. And I'm also not bouncing the bike off the rev limiter and riding it as hard as maybe some others will. So I felt really comfortable stretching that interval on the top end to 170 hours. But I'm super anxious to get inside there and actually see how things look after riding this bike for the last year and a half plus. So let's get right into it. The first thing we're going to go ahead and do is take the seat off and the side panels and pull the gas tank off of the bike. Alright, now that we got the gas tank off, we're definitely in some need of cleaning down here, so I'm going to do my best to kind of get this all clean in here before we start taking anything off of the engine. This is mostly clean now. There's still some stuff that I got to get. But I just took a brush to it with some Simple Green and brushed it all out and then blew it out with the shop vac just to make sure that there's no dirt up here in these cables that could fall down into the motor. But what I'm going to start doing is start taking off some of this stuff that's connected to the motor and specifically the top end of the motor so we can begin to get it free from anything connected to it in preparation for it to come out. And along the way I'm going to wipe off and clean up any other areas that need it as we go. So we're going to start by getting the exhaust off and then draining the coolant, and then we will move to some of these other things here and just slowly start pulling pieces off of the top end. Okay, so the rear shock actually has to come out in order to get the exhaust out of here, which involves taking off the muffler, taking the bolts out here and separating the linkage down here. Lots of fun stuff to try and get that out of there, but it's out. Also, one important thing, I've heard that you can get the head out of this bike with the motor still in the frame, and that's what we're going to try and do. I hope to God that that is what we can do, because I really don't want to pull the whole motor out of the bike, because that's going to significantly extend the time that all of this is going to take. I'm going to go ahead now and drain all of the coolant out of the bike before I start pulling off some hoses, and then we'll continue on the process of taking other stuff off of the head here. So everything is disconnected from the head. I drained the coolant as you saw, disconnected the coolant tube up here from the top, and then I had to swing the subframe up to get the throttle body off of the head here, and all the other connectors are unplugged. And I also took the cables that are running here and I zip tied them up more out of the way so I have as much clearance as possible to be working in here. The next thing we're going to do is take off the valve cover and verify, make sure that the motor is in top dead center, and then we'll lock it in top dead center before we begin taking out the cam chain tensioner and then the cams and all of that stuff so we can get the head off of the top of the motor here. So we're going to go ahead and get started on that. Alright, we can see with these two red dots lined up on the cams that the motor is in top dead center, so now we'll go ahead and lock that into place. Something worth mentioning is you should probably unhook your battery really before getting this far. I didn't, because this is a street legal bike, so it's got a keyed ignition and the key's not in it and the kill switch is off, so there's no chance this thing could start, but it would be good to disconnect the battery anyways. Also hoping that I can do this without having to drain the oil. So what I'm going to do is lean the bike. Okay, now I've got the bike leaned over a little bit hopefully, so I can do this without having to drain the oil on the bike. We will see. Remove the washer. Stick this back in. There's a little groove you can see in there. Alright, now the bike is locked. Top dead center. Now we won't lose timing or anything like that. Got the cam chain tensioner out. The cam chain is now loose. A pro tip that helps me getting just enough clearance to get the cam chain tensioner past the frame is if you undo the motor bolts up here and down here, and then you put like a big wrench in here, you can just lift the motor back a touch to clearance that out of there. Yeah, I spent forever trying to figure out how to do that when I shimmed my valves a while back, but that works like a charm every time. Now that we got the cam chain tensioner out, we can remove the cams. To do that, we got to take out these 8 bolts up here on the cam bridge. The manual states that you should work from the outside in, so that's what we're going to do. Alright, so now that the cams are out, the next stage is actually removing the cylinder head. We're going to remove this little bolt out here, and then there's 2 or 4 10 mils, and you just work in a crisscross pattern, and then the head should come off. Alright, it's the moment of truth. Now we really get to see if the head will come off with the motor still in the bike. The manual doesn't tell you, at least not that I saw. It shows the motor out of the bike for all motor work. So I am really hoping that it does, but I guess we will find out. Okay, it's off the studs. Now I just gotta get it out of here actually. Alright, so I got it out. I just had to do a little bit of shimmying with the radiator here and push it out of the way. But it's out, and that's what the piston looks like. 170 hours. Some carbon buildup on there. We'll get the jug off and take a look at the rings and all that stuff and see how it looks, but I don't know. I don't know what it should look like, but it doesn't necessarily look too bad to me. And here's the head. Carbon buildup there too. The valves look pretty decent. Spark plug looks okay. Everything looks pretty good to me. Feel free to leave a comment on what you think, but so far so good. Alright, the next thing it says to do is remove the gasket, and then we will lift the jug only far enough to get access to the piston pin, and we'll take that out and leave the piston inside of the cylinder. Oh, there we go. Oh, I can already see the cross hatching on the cylinder, and it looks freaking good. Okay, so I can see the circlip in here now. I'm gonna stuff a rag down in the motor here. That way nothing can fall down into the motor. Hallelujah! Finally got the circlip out of there. It was a bitch to get out. Had to fab up my own little flathead narrow enough to get in there and get it out. Luckily that worked and I was able to get it out. So now I'll push out the wrist pin and then lift the jug off and take a look at the cylinder. Be careful and make sure you don't scratch anything. Alright. Alright, the piston is out. I can't tell if that looks good or not, or if that's how it's supposed to look. Rather, let me zoom in real quick. So there is some wear right there on the end, on both sides. Looks like a pretty decent scratch right there, but that doesn't look to have transferred to the motor or anything, or the cylinder. And then it's gonna be hard to see, but if we look in the jug here, you can see there's lots of cross hatching still all intact in here. And there's no nicks or anything. There's only some wear right there on both sides. But other than that, it all looks pretty good. So I'll probably take this to the shop tomorrow, have him take a look at it, see what he thinks, and then we'll go from there. All right, it's the next day. Took in the cylinder into a local shop, and the consensus seems to be that it looks pretty good. And I was reading, and I don't know whether it's true or not, but a lot of people say that trying to hone a Nickel coated cylinder is bad. I just saw a lot of reports that you just shouldn't hone a Nickel coated cylinder. I certainly don't want to try it myself since I've never done it. And the cross hatching is still there and it looks good, and those marks that are in the cylinder wall, you can't feel them or anything, so they're only visible. There's nothing that you can feel there. So I'm just probably going to clean it up with some soapy water and a green Scotch-Brite and just make sure it's all nice and clean. And then we'll put the piston back in it and put the jug back on the bike. I am waiting for the valve spring compressing tool to come in the mail so I can do the valve seals as well. So once that comes in, I'll be able to finish up the rest of the bike. But today I'm just going to clean some things up, get some stuff ready, clean the head, at least on the outside, and probably put the cylinder back into the piston, put the piston back into the cylinder, put that on here, and then we'll wait for that tool to show up and hopefully get it all wrapped up. So what I'm going to do here is just take an old toothbrush and a little bit of brake cleaner and just try and scrub off as much of the carbon buildup in here as I can. Not going to be super forceful with anything, but just try and clean it up a little bit and probably call it good. Alright, it looks quite a bit better. I took some throttle body cleaner. It actually worked a lot better, and just scrubbed a little bit more and scraped off some bigger chunks. There's just a little bit left right here in the middle, but other than that, it looks a lot better than it did, nice and clean. Most people seem to agree that you should at least Scotch-Brite your cylinder to basically clean out any deposits in the cross hatching. And just make sure it's nice and clean. So that's what we're gonna do. First, I'm actually gonna probably clean out the cylinder wall with a towel and a rag just to make sure there's no foreign debris in there. And then we'll go ahead and take WD-40 and a green Scotch-Brite and we'll lube in here. And what we'll do is we'll just follow the cross hatching that's already in the cylinder and just give it a few passes until it looks good, and then we'll go give it a warm soapy bath, make sure it's all nice and clean. So I'm just going in and out at an angle here, trying to follow the cross hatching that's already in the cylinder. I'm going to go back the other way now, follow the cross hatching in the other direction. So let's repeat this few times until I think it's clean enough. I don't know if you can see in there from up here, or in there from up there, but it's looking pretty good. Also got rid of most of the carbon that was built up here on the top as well. So after we give it a soapy bath too, we'll spray it with WD-40 just to keep it clean and from oxidizing, anything like that. All right, so when there got it cleaned, you can see the cross hatching is still pretty good in there. Yeah, it's a better view of it. Yeah, so that's what it looks like after 170 hours still. There is ever so slight wear, but you can't feel it. So, and I took a white microfiber and wiped it around in there, and it came out perfectly white and clean, so I know that it is ready to go. So we're going to go ahead and get this lubed up with some WD-40 and just clean off the seal surfaces, top and bottom, and probably drop it in there with the piston. We've got the piston all set up here with the cylinder, and then I have the old piston here for reference. I'm going to get the rings on the piston and get the piston into the cylinder. You want to follow whatever directions come with whatever piston you've ordered for proper ring gap spacing and all of that good stuff, but I won't bore you with that process. We will be putting the piston in from the top. That's what the manual states. I just have this Harbor Freight here piston ring tool that I'm hoping works good to get that in there. But yeah, you'll want to make sure you lube up everything really well before you try and slide the piston in there. Okay, so I got the rings on, making sure that you pay special attention to the ring end gap spacing and where they're at. Usually should be an arrow on the piston pointing towards the front. I know that the timing chain is on the right hand side of the bike, so this is going to be the front of the motor going this way, and so I'm going to install the piston this way. I do have some motor oil here and also the piston ring compressing tool here that I'm going to make sure is nice and clean inside and out. We don't want any foreign metallic debris anywhere. What we'll do is lube things up and then make sure everything's nice and lubed, including the piston ring compressor and the cylinder itself with some motor oil here. And then we'll go ahead and compress the rings, and we're going to end up sliding the piston in from the top into the motor. And I did also already put the circlip in one side of the piston. As you'll recall, I pulled the wrist pin out of the left-hand side of the bike, so I put the right-hand circlip in, and we'll slide the wrist pin back in the same way and insert the last circlip on the left-hand side here. So we'll slowly get this going here, making sure we're paying special attention to the rings, making sure that they're not moving. That ring gap is good. I'll do one last check of the ring gap. That's about as tight as that's gonna get. Then making sure we got the arrow pointed towards the front of the bike. And there we go. Piston in the cylinder. Okay. Alright, I think I'm going to wrap things up there for the night. I shined my phone light down in there and I could just barely see that the ring end gap is right here in the back, in the middle, which is exactly what this says on the manual there. Whatever, can't see it. Anyways, that's really all I can do tonight until I have the tool to compress the valve springs in there and get the valves out so I can put new valve seals in there. But it's coming along. I am ready to be done because I want to ride, and next week it's supposed to be good weather, so hopefully all the rest of this goes well and we can get riding again. But I'll catch you guys in a little bit. Alright, we're back. Finally got the valve spring compression tool, and I just tested it out, removing one valve from the bike so far to make sure it works. Just got this kit off Amazon. It's like 16 bucks or something like that. Seems to do the job. Putting the little keepers back in later should be a fun task, but I'm going to proceed to remove these other valves in here and replace the valve seals down there, a little red thing down there, and replace those with some new ones. We'll go ahead and put the valves back in. I'm also going to try and clean off some of the gunk on the back of the intake valves here prior to putting those back in. But yeah, I'm going to go ahead and take the rest of the valves out, make sure I keep note of where all the keepers and the shims went, so I put them back in the same order. Put the valves back in the same spot. It's important that everything goes back exactly where it was before, so that way you don't have any issues with seating or anything like that when you assemble the bike again. In order to remove the valve stem seals, if you're not going to be reusing them, which I wouldn't recommend, I'd recommend putting new ones in. You can just use some basically needle nose pliers to go in there and grab those seals right out of there. So that's what we're going to do now. Alright, I just had to switch pliers. Something that grabs it just a little bit better, the profile of it, to get it out of there. Alright, so in order to put the new valve seal in, what we're going to do is we're going to just lube this seal up with some oil. So I've got some oil and a little cap over here, so just drop that in. Alright, so that's all oiled. Take the take the valve, put it up in through the slot there, and then we'll slide the valve stem seal onto the valve to use it to guide it down. And then in the instance of these valve seals, a 10 mil fits pretty well right around the valve seal. So we're gonna go ahead and use that to seat this valve stem seal. Valve stem seal seated down in there, and then we'll just go around and repeat that same process. It's important to make sure you pay attention to which way your springs came out and make sure you leave them that way. The tightest coils are going to be at the bottom. I just left this upper seat on here anyways, just so I don't forget or space, but it's very important that everything goes back exactly how it came out. So what I'm doing now is removing the valves. I've already removed them once, but I'm going to take them all out. I'm actually going to have the head sent off, or I'm not going to send it off. I actually have a local shop that's going to be able to touch up the valve seats for the exhaust side, because there's some marks which I'll show you in a second, but also I'm going to take these off again and relook at them, make sure they're good, and then if the shop feels like the exhaust side needs to be touched up, then we can have, or the intake side needs to be touched up, then we can have that done at the same time. But I do have some new Pro X titanium exhaust valves here that are going to be put in here, because the old exhaust ones have some pits in them, and I'll show those to you as well when I show you the marks in the head. I've read everywhere, and the general consensus is that you do not lap titanium valves, especially coated ones. So that's why I went with all new valves, and then that's why I'm also going to be having these valve seats just touched up and make sure that the new exhaust valves seat well with the exhaust valves here, and then we'll have them take a look at the intake ones, make sure those look good, but they looked good to me. The main reason why I am having the valves touched up is you can see this little nick right here at the tip of my finger. So you can see that's basically a pit in the exhaust valve seat, and it's most of the width of the seat. So while the valves probably would seat pretty well and maybe not give me any issues for a bit longer, I felt like it was best to just have the valve seats touched up anyways while it's out. So that's why I'm doing that. This one I just pulled out and haven't even cleaned, and you can see that there's definitely some exhaust gases sneaking by here a little bit. So a new valve there and touching that seat up will help on that side. Conversely, you can see that the intake side looks really nice. That's just some dust there. Nothing, no nicks or dings or pits or anything on the intake side, so that's super good. And then on the, I'll set that there for a moment. On the exhaust valve, you can see those pits in the valve seat surface. And so that's why we're replacing the valves, is those aren't gonna probably last very long. And you could end up with leaky valves here, and who knows how much time. But while we're already this far into the motor, might as well take it apart and have it done right. I'm gonna go ahead and take out the take out this intake valve here. So I just took out the shim from the top, and then for this tool, the valve spring compressor, you have the piece that compresses the spring up here. It's got access so you can get the little retaining clips out, and then this part goes on the other side here, right in the center of the valve. So we'll line it up, snug this up into here, like so. And then you might be able to see it, but that's centered over the valve in there, and then this on this side is centered on the valve here. And then what we'll do is tighten this, make sure we're perfectly square on the valve in here. And if you're not, just back it up a little bit, make sure you're centered, hand tighten it, and then we'll use the little tool here to tighten it. Bring it around this way. So what we're doing is we're going to tighten this down until there's little tiny little retaining pins on the inside here that, or not pins, they're little, I don't know what the technical name for them is, but you'll see them once you start compressing it, and I'll show you one. You'll need one of these little magnet tools to fish them out of there. That's what it looks like. I don't know if you can see that on the camera. Yeah. So there's two of these halves. So yeah, let's fish them both out of there. The magnet. And then when they're out, just loosen the valve spring compressor. We'll rock that out of there. The valve springs themselves will come out, and then we can push the valve out the bottom, and you have your valve like so. Don't fumble it or drop it like I almost did. It's important to, at least if you're in the engine this far, you might as well take apart the valves and replace the valve seals like I've already done. For 3 of them so far, I just need to do the last intake, or the last exhaust one. But it's important that you replace those, and then you might as well check the seats on the valves on the intake and exhaust side, make sure they're good, because it's never going to be easier than it is right now to have any of the work done on the head. And you might as well just do it right the first time, which is what I'm going to do, and hopefully this will never have to come apart again within the next 170 hours, and I can ride it for another 2 years without anything but oil changes and valve checks. So, but yeah, that's basically that. I'm going to go ahead and finish taking the valves out of this. I'm writing down Ziploc bags and putting all the corresponding valve pieces in the bag and marking which side and where they came from. That way it can all go back together the way it was taken apart, so there's no potential issues there, and that the valves map to the correct spot so they seat well in terms of the intake ones. The exhaust ones will be handled at the shop. So yeah. Alright, so we just got the head back from the local shop. They went ahead and cleaned the other valves for me, and made sure that these new valves seated well, and then we also got the seats nice and clean and all ready to go, get put back together. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna finish replacing this one valve stem seal in there, and then we're gonna put this top end back together, and we're gonna start getting the bike back together. Now that what we're gonna do, since everything's ready to go, I got the new exhaust valves here, is I'm gonna use some assembly lube on these, and we're gonna basically lube up the valves here on the stem portion of it, and then slide them up through, and then we'll go ahead and reassemble the valves and put the springs back on and the keepers back in and get the head all dialed. We will have to adjust the shims for the exhaust side because we got new valves, so the shimming is going to be a little bit different, but we'll get the head all back on the bike, get the cams on, and we'll take measurements and see where we need to go, take the cams off, and just go that route. Take a little bit of time, but let's just make sure we do it just right. So yeah, I'm going to reassemble the head and get it all back together. So now that we got the head back together and the piston's already in the cylinder, the next thing we're going to do is apply some sealant over the case halves I'm using some 3-bond for this. The manual calls for like Loctite 5910, which is expensive and hard to find. Seems to be 3-bond, works just as well, so that's what I'm going to use. So I'll put a little dab of 3-bond where the case halves meet, and then we'll go ahead and put the base gasket on, and then we'll take the piston and the cylinder and slide that on, and then we'll put in the new wrist pin and the new circlip, get the piston all in, then we'll seat the cylinder, and then from there we'll take the head and put it on and torque down the bolts. So that's what we're going to get going. Just make sure the area is clean and dry, and you don't want too much, so you don't want that falling down and clogging anything up. Now the base gasket can only go on one direction. Like so. Make sure that it seats well. Make sure all your dowels are good. Alright, now we'll get the cylinder head. Okay, so the piston's already in the cylinder, and then what we're going to do is basically push it down so that way we have visibility to the wrist pin, and we can put it on like we did last time. Remember, I already installed the circlip on the other side of the piston, so the wrist pin will slide in this way and stop, and then we'll go ahead and put in the last one. There's that, basically. Okay, there's a good chance that you really won't be able to see exactly what I'm doing here, but you can see in here is the rod, and then the piston itself. I'm gonna have to push down the piston just a little bit more. Okay, that looks pretty good. Boom, that's it. Now it's in. So I don't know if you can see that, now that's in there. And then the last thing that we need to do is put in the circlip into the end of the piston. And before we do that, we're going to lay a towel down in here. That way if the circlip falls, we're not fishing it out, basically. Now I'm going to go ahead and try and get that circlip in there. There's not going to be much for you to see, so we'll catch back up when that's done. Alright, the wrist pin is in, and the circlip is in. We're going to remove this rag now. Thank the Lord, that was a pain. And we're going to let the jug slide down into where it should be. There we go. Boom. Now the next part is we're going to get the head in here, and the head gasket first, and then get the head in here, and then we'll be ready to torque it down. Alright, so we'll put the head gasket on. I've already cleaned up the head gasket area as well. Everything looks good. Now on the head, I did already put the valves in. Everything's in check there. Put a new spark plug in already as well. Okay, so now we're just gonna work to center that over the holes and slowly slide it down into place. Alright, that is that. So now the next thing to do is we're gonna start torquing this baby down. Sorry, I know I haven't shown any of the manual yet, but this is the cylinder head nut tightening sequence. This is what the manual states. So we're gonna go ahead and tighten diagonally, first to 7.4 foot-pounds, and then we'll move to 22.1 foot-pounds, and then finally we'll move to 36.9 foot-pounds. Says the thread should be oiled with engine oil, and then cone greased. So that's what we'll do when we're torquing this down. So we got the bolts on. The hardest ones are the ones on the inside. You got to use like a magnet to get the washers where they need to be, and to get the nuts in the right spot without dropping them down into the engine head. Now we're going to begin tightening these. We won't go a whole bunch right off the gate on any one spot. So we'll just keep doing this and we'll work our way around diagonally, making sure we follow the specified torque pattern that I showed you, as well as the torque steps. So we'll just keep on moving up, and I'll catch you guys in a little bit. Now that we have the head on and torqued properly, we are going to put the cams in and the cam chain back on and the tensioner back in. And then we're going to check the valves and the valve shims again and make sure the valve clearances are what they should be. They're probably going to need some adjustment. So we're going to go ahead and take the measurements and then put in new shims as needed. Since we did change the exhaust valves out for brand new ones, I'm expecting those to need adjustment. But that's what we're going to go ahead and do right now. Before we install the cams, we're going to go ahead and put in some assembly lube in these areas where the cams sit, and make sure that that's kind of all nice and lubed up. We don't want to start the motor or spin it over while it's dry and the bearing surfaces are dry, so we're going to go ahead and do that. Okay, and then what I did is went ahead and made sure that the bearing surfaces on the cams are clean as well. Once we get the cams in and set and torqued down, we're also going to actually turn the motor over a few times before we check the valve clearances. So it's important that we make sure these parts are nice and lubed up. That way we're not causing any unneeded wear on any of the bearing surfaces before the motor gets properly oiled up. Keep in mind, we're also trying to make sure timing is correct, so we have to line up the red dots on the cams again as well. So we got pretty much everything attached to the head. Cam chain tensioner is in, exhaust is in, all the coolant hoses are where they should be, intake is on, and rear subframe is back and mounted, shocks mounted. Pretty much everything's good to go. So we cranked the motor a few times after removing the screw from down here and freeing up the crankshaft. We were able to rotate the motor a few times and take valve measurements. So I've got those clearance measurements right over here. As you can see, the exhaust is super tight because they're brand new valves and the seats were touched up. So we're going to go ahead and take out the cams again and pull out the stock shims, and then we're going to go ahead and shim the valves. I just checked the valve clearances for the last time and everything is in spec. So I torqued the cam bridge to spec, cam chain tensioner is in, and I rotated the motor a few times and rechecked the valve clearances to make sure they're perfect. As you know, I had to go quite a bit smaller shim in the front because new valves and having the exhaust seats cut is going to make that a much tighter fit than it was before. So we got that all corrected and everything is perfect. I'm going to start buttoning the bike back up, getting everything together, making sure I've got everything where it should be, put fresh coolant in the bike, and then it should be ready to fire up for the first time. I don't know if I'll get to it tonight, it's about 10 o'clock, but definitely be recording when I do start it up for the first time. Fingers crossed everything goes as it should. Alright, see if she starts. Alright, she runs. I've already heat cycled it twice. I took the cams back out again and re-torqued the head bolts to make sure they were still torqued to spec after 3 heat cycles that I did earlier. Now I'm going to go probably right around the neighborhood and see how it feels, vary the throttle, and get the rings properly seated for the last time. So that's basically all there is to it. It's just making sure the rings are seated well now, and then I'm going to take it out this weekend and probably ride it, and then if that all goes well, then I'll bring it back here and we'll do an oil change on it. But that's basically it. This was a really long process, and I don't necessarily want to have to do it again, so I'm happy that it takes so many hours before this has to be done, but now the bike should be good to go for quite a while more. Who knows if I'll even own it long enough to see the next top end rebuild on this bike, but it should give me plenty of more life out of it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned something from it. Maybe you'll choose to tackle this project on your own bike. It's not super difficult. It just takes some time and patience, lots of patience. I recommend not doing it if you're in a hurry or you're trying to meet a deadline. It's best to do this definitely in the winter time or the off season, so you can just take your time and do it right without trying to rush through it and make any mistakes. So yeah, that's it. I'm gonna wrap this up and then I'm gonna take it out for a spin. Alright, it's been a couple weeks now since I finished the top end rebuild, and I've been able to get the bike out and really put it through its paces through a few rides. Happy to report that everything is great. The bike runs awesome. In fact, I feel like it runs a little bit stronger than it did before I replaced the rings. So maybe the rings were already kind of getting to where they needed to be replaced, or it could just be my mind and I feel like the bike is more powerful than it was. But either way, it runs awesome. I just checked the valves the other day and everything's still perfectly in spec, which is great. I'm super happy that I was able to perform this myself and save myself some money and also learn a lot in the process. I feel a lot more confident now in my ability to do the work on my bike and really diagnose problems and get into things. All you really need is some simple tools and some time and patience, and it's important not to rush anything, because that's when mistakes start to happen. But hopefully this video is informative for you guys. I know it was a little bit on the long side. I tried to cut out as much as I could without missing any of the important details, but hopefully it encourages you guys to tackle this job yourself, and if anything, at least learn something in the process. But yeah, leave a comment below. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.